area as a whole should not get changed. Of course, that also can be changed, but if you change it, then there will be a lot of waste of time, right? Lot of effort wasted. Okay. Therefore, keep the area, to a particular research focus that you would like to explore. But of course, the title, it could change, right? So that's why we are calling it as a working title, right? Even at the last moment, we will change the research title. Even the aim and objectives, they will evolve. So no problem at all. But as a whole, you need to keep it as within a particular area, right? So we will discuss about the title. Then how are we going to develop the introduction, background to the research? Problem statement, we need to write a problem statement. Then the justification of the research, right? Aim and objectives, right? And after that, a brief methodology, scope and limitation, chapter breakdown, references are also need to be given within the synopsis. Okay, so we will go through these one by one. Now, if we take the synopsis, it basically guides your research. Okay, synopsis, once well developed, can be used as your chapter 1 of the thesis as well. Right now, when you at the end of the dissertation submission, you need to compile a thesis. Okay, research thesis. In this thesis, the introduction chapter will be mostly from your synopsis. Okay, so it will basically take the format of the synopsis. So the synopsis that you're going to write at the beginning will serve that purpose as well. Okay. On top of that, once you develop the synopsis or the research proposal, from a very early stage, you are going to think about the research area, the manner in which you are going to carry out the study, and so on. Right? On top of that, synopsis guides your research. Okay, it provides a structured approach to your research. Right? So basically, some of the components that include in the synopsis, say for example, the background, problem statement, aim and objectives, methodology. So they basically provide the guidance to your research, right? When it comes to the background problem statement component, it provides the why aspect of your study, right? So why am I doing this study? Within the background and the problem statement, you need to justify your research, isn't it? Right? So why am I selecting a particular research area? So that justification will be provided with the background problem statement section, which will add the why component to your research. Right? Now we have about 12 participants. Any of y'all, have you all thought about the research area that you are going to do? Any of you thought about the broader research area of your thesis? How about we have Erang, Hansani, Logendra? Have you all thought about the research area? I mean, it doesn't have to be the finalized one, but have you all thought about the research area? At least yes or no answer should be there, isn't it? Any of you? Dilini, can I check? Yes, Inoka? Inoka or Inoka?
Not, madam, but it's
Okay, you are muted again.
it's not, madam, but it is better to select from our workplace. I think that I'm working at Urban Development Authority, so it's I think to develop research from my industrial background.
Fine. Okay. Yeah. That's good, right? So now she would select a particular area related to urban development, right? And it will be a practice problem that she has seen from the industry, from the practice, but we need to add a theoretical background, right? So now just imagine there are thousands of research areas in the world, but she's going to focus on the urban development side, right? So there should be a particular reason for that, isn't it? Why is not doing on, we'll say, artificial intelligence or construction cost or client management, but she's going to focus on the urban development area, right? So why? There should be a reason for that. Okay, so this why aspect will be provided from your background and the justification section. You need to justify there's this type of a research problem in this particular area, in the urban development area, and then to take that forward. Okay, so writing the background, the problem statement section will provide the why aspect of your study. Okay, and after that, once you narrow down your research area, you're going to write about the aim and objectives, right? So having justified the why aspect, next you're going to talk about the what aspect. So what am I going to do? And that will be articulated within the aim and objectives. This is what I'm going to do. This will be my aim. These are my objectives, right? So you can see that the what aspect will be fulfilled by the aim and objectives of your synopsis. And after that, identifying the aim and objectives will not be sufficient, right? So you need to have a way to fulfill your aim and objectives. And that will be done through the methodology of your synopsis. Right? So briefly, you need to identify the methodology as well. Right? So the why aspect, what aspect, and the how aspect will be given within the synopsis. Therefore, synopsis is kind of a guideline, or it provides guidance to your research. Okay, so with that understanding, think about developing the synopsis in a very something that's very important for your success of the research. Okay, and then pay more attention to that and do it. Right. Okay, now we will go through the key components of the research and discuss them. Right. So the title, as I mentioned to you all earlier, it will be a working title because it will change, it will evolve, right? Don't worry about that. But as I mentioned to you all earlier, do not change the area. I mean, do not jump from one area to another area, right? Because it will just waste your time and effort. We will quickly go through the characteristics of a good working title. Right? Now, a title should be relatively short. Okay, do not write a very lengthy titles because then it will be difficult to understand. But use few words and write a very concise, short, relevant title. And also the title should be simple so that the reader can easily understand. Right? Do not use any difficult words. Right? It should read very simple. And the title should provide an understanding of the scope of the study. Okay, so once we read the title, it should give a good understanding to the reader about the scope of the study involved. That is also important. And within the title, avoid using the abbreviations. Okay. So generally, I mean, there can be certain very common abbreviations. Even if so, better to avoid such abbreviations, right? So use the full terms and then write the title of your research. Okay. And moving on to the next part, which is the research background. So research background provides the context of the research, right? So when you are developing the research background, you need to go through the previous literature on the topic. right? Probably a brief history of your study, right? What has been carried out elsewhere, right? And then the current information surrounding the research area. Okay, so all this should be provided within the research background, right? So essentially, even if your selected area is from a practice-based problem, you need to dig into the literature and provide a very good theoretical background to your study, right? So if I take a small example about a particular study, so we take as construction waste management strategies in Sri Lanka. How are we going to develop the background to this particular area, right? So you can provide some, now since waste is kind of an alarming factor and which increases day by day, right? So probably we can provide some statistical information and highlight, give some statistics about construction waste, right? And we can say that it is increasing globally day by day, right? And then provide some statistics, right? And also, what is important is now your study could be about the Sri Lankan context, right? Most of our studies. But when you're writing the background, make sure that you start from the global context. Okay, so around the world, construction waste is increasing. And then you can provide some statistics, right? And then the generation of waste creates issues to several parties, to clients, contractors, to the environment, right? So all these, you need to do them with appropriate literature support. Okay. And after providing the global context and highlighting that the generation of waste is an issue, later in your background section, you can move on to the Sri Lankan context, right? So similar to the global context, the waste in Sri Lanka has been identified as an issue. It is increasing, right? And probably give some statistics as well. Okay. So this is the way that you need to develop your research background. Okay. Highlighting why you're going to do this study, right? If there isn't a particular need for us to do the study, and if the generation of waste is not an issue, then no point in doing this study, isn't it? Right? Therefore, you need to highlight why we are going to do this particular study, right? That will be fulfilled through the background section of the synopsis. Okay? So I hope it's clear. So basically, once you identify or once you highlight your research problem, why am I doing this research problem, it will set the scene for the forthcoming research. The reader will understand the importance of this study, right? Therefore, background section is very important. And then, now there will be many literature we need to refer to. Okay. Now, say for example, we call this as the funnel approach, right? There will be literature distantly related to your study. Okay, there will be literature distantly related to your study. And also, there will be some literature somewhat close to your study, but they do not exactly match with your research area, right? And there will be some literature very pretty much related to the focus area you are going to explore, right? So when you go through the literature, you will be able to categorize them into different parts, right? Background related literature, right? And then through them, you will be able to narrow them down to a certain extent. And after that, there will be very specific literature related to your research issue. Okay. So carefully understand these, right? And then provide appropriate weightage to the research, to the literature that you are focusing on. Okay. So at the beginning, you might go through this distantly related work, right? And then once you read more, you will understand what am I very specifically looking at from this particular research, and then you will be able to narrow them down further, right? And once you go through them in detail, you will be able to identify the closely related literature to your study, right? So more attention should be paid in this part, right? But of course, we need this background related literature as well in order to develop the research, right? But more attention should be given here, right? And then this will be the focus of your study. Okay? Right. And sometimes we call this as the hourglass notion of research as well, right? So you will begin with the broader context, with the broader related literature, and then identify the exact area you want to explore. And after that, you are going to further explore in this identified area, right? So your research problem will be here. And once you go for the data collection and analysis, you are going to expand this and then finally derive the conclusions, right? So at the moment, we will be focusing on this, the first part of the hourglass, where you need to go through the broader literature and then come on to the closely related literature and identify the research area. Okay. So I will take another example. This is about impact of post-disaster reconstruction projects towards the community culture in Sri Lanka, right? So we will see, actually this is from one of my past research students' work. We will try to identify how the background related to the study has been developed. Okay, so the impact of post-disaster reconstruction projects towards the community culture in Sri Lanka, that is the research area. So first, you are going to, we could identify the impact of disasters, and then why we are going for the post-disaster reconstruction, and then the factors that has to be considered for post-disaster reconstruction. And among these factors, we can identify one of them as the culture, because as you can see, the title includes a cultural investigation of the cultural component as well. And then we are relating it to the Sri Lankan context, right? So starting from the broader literature, impact of disasters, now it will be a distantly related literature, somewhere fits here, right? And then we are going to narrow it down to post-disaster reconstruction, and then the factors that we need to consider for post-disaster reconstruction, and then on to the cultural factors, right? So all these will be done through the global literature. And finally, we are relating it to the Sri Lankan context, right? So remember, when you develop your research problem, when you write your research background, start it from the global context. And also, it's good to have these type of subheadings, right? Incorporate these type of subheadings, and then later on, you can delete them. When you submit your research synopsis, you can delete these subheadings and do that, right? But when you are developing the research synopsis, try to divide it into several subheadings so that from the subheadings itself, you will be able to narrow it down. Okay, narrow it down to the particular research area you want. Okay, so here you can see the impact of disasters discussed. Remember, it is a must for you to include the citations. Okay, you cannot just develop the synopsis with your own ideas. There should be appropriate recent citations as well. Okay. And then the need for post-disaster reconstruction, another 1 or 2 paragraphs. And then the factors impacting the post-disaster reconstruction. And then why the culture is one of them. And finally, moving on to the Sri Lankan context. Right? So think about all these and then try to write a very appropriate background to your research. Okay. Then moving on to the next section, the problem statement. Problem statement. So by the time that you reach the problem statement, you all have provided a background to your study, background to your research. Okay. And then next is the problem statement component. Within the problem statement, we are going to give a concise description of the issues that needs to be addressed, right? Within the problem statement also, now some students think that you do not need to include citations within the problem statement, which is not correct, right? Even in the problem statement, you need to include citations, right? But it's going to be a concise description of the study, right? So by merely going through the problem statement, the reader will be able to understand the problem that we are going to explore. Okay, so it's going to be a concise description of the research that we are going to do. And here, as it's mentioned here, direct readers' attention quickly to the issues that we are going to explore. Okay. And the problem that you have discovered and how you intend to address the problem will be briefly given within the problem statement section. Right? Now, there will be different ways of developing problem statements. Right? And when you are developing it, you can discuss this with your supervisors as well. I'm going to briefly outline a method, one of the methods that we can use, right? But this doesn't need to be the way that you are going to write your problem statement. This can be a possible way of doing it, okay? Here, in the problem statement, I have divided into 3 parts: the ideal, the reality, and the consequence, okay? The ideal situation, what the reality is, and then the consequence, right? So we will go through this and try to understand it. The ideal will be, it describes the desired goal or the ideal situation, right? Explains how things should be, right? It's actually the desired goal. And then the reality is, describes the condition that prevents the goal or the ideal situation being achieved. Now, there can be certain difficulties for us to achieve the ideal situation. So that is given within the reality part of the problem statement, right? So basically what the current situation is, okay? And then the consequence is, it identifies the way you propose to improve the reality towards the ideal situation, right? Now, if you all have thought about your research areas, right? Now, I think Inoka has thought about it, right? It will be within the urban development, right? So likewise, if you all have thought about your research areas, now you can think, right? So the ideal situation should be like this, right? But the reality is something somewhat different to the ideal situation. And then my goal will be to ensure the reality will be moved toward the ideal situation. Right? So now in your minds, you should be able to get this picture. Right? Now, if I relate my thoughts, even though I don't know much about Inoka's study, I can think about a particular pattern, right? It's about, we'll say, urban development. The ideal, the urban development should be something like this, but the reality is something like this. And then what needs to be done to improve this reality towards the ideal situation, right? So in your minds, now you all should be able to think about the problem statement, right? Okay, now I'll take a small example and further explain developing the ideal, the problem statement area, right? So the ideal situation, now we have taken an example from a particular university. According to the XY University mission statement, the university seeks to provide students with a safe, healthy learning environment. Dormitories are one important aspect of that learning environment, right? So we are saying about the university learning environment, and then their accommodation or the dormitories are one of the important aspects of their learning environment. Okay? And the students spend a considerable amount of their time in these dormitories, right? So this is the ideal situation. Okay? But the reality is, students living in dorms A, B, C, and D currently do not have air conditioning units, right? And then during the hot seasons, they encounter many difficulties, right? So we can see the ideal situation is to provide a good learning environment within the university, and dormitories are part of them. But the reality is, the condition of the dormitories are not very good, right? So this is the reality. Then the last component of the problem statement is the consequence. How are we going to ensure the reality is moved towards the ideal situation, right? So here it says identification of various mechanisms to improve the humidity level and the comfort to the students is therefore important. And then we are going to briefly say what we are going to do. A participative investigation into identifying the conditions of the air conditioners will be done so that the reality will be improved towards the ideal situation, right? So the problem statement, you all can concisely provide the research, right? The reader will be able to understand what you are going to explore in a quick manner, right? There's a particular ideal situation, but the reality is like this. And then from this study, this is what I am going to do. So you need to lead into this particular point. Okay. Any questions from what we have done so far? Right? Anything you want to ask? Maybe you want to briefly talk about your research area, right? Anything you want to ask? So up to now, we talked about the problem statement, the background to the study that basically set the scene to your study, right? You need to go through initial literature and narrow it down to a particular area. And then with the problem statement, we are very specifically writing about the research problem we are exploring, right? And then there can be different components to the research problem: the ideal, the reality, and then the consequence. These will be concisely provided within the problem statement, right? Anything you want to ask? It could be related to your study or something about this. Right. So I will go through another study so that you all will get a better understanding. Now, this was about COVID-19 preventive practices, knowledge, attitude, and behavior of the construction workforce in Sri Lanka. Okay. So the background will be starting from the global context, right? And here what we did was, the problem statement was very specifically focused on the Sri Lankan context only. Right? So within the background, we only provided the global context. And then from the problem statement, we specifically targeted the Sri Lankan context, right? So you can say the global literature was provided to highlight the impact of COVID, right? And then the knowledge, attitude, and the behavior of the workforce in general in the construction industry, as well as specifically during the COVID-19. And then from the problem statement, specifically talked about the Sri Lankan context, right? How it has impacted, and then how can we resolve this the behavior of the workforce towards positively acting for COVID-19 practice. These will be briefly provided within the research problem area. Okay, so you all can discuss with your supervisors and identify the best way forward, best way to write the background and the problem statement, and do it in a very appropriate manner. Okay, right. So having discussed the background and the problem statement, next is developing the aim and objectives, not aims and objectives, right? So your study will have one aim and several objectives. Okay, one aim and few objectives, right? And aim, it should be always a singular statement, right? What it is you are seeking to achieve by undertaking this research. It should be a singular statement, right? It basically provides the direction to your research, and the aim will be fairly focused, right? So here note the term fairly. Okay, aim will be fairly focused, right? It should not be too much narrowed down as well. It should be, your aim should be fairly focused, right? But when it comes to the objectives, of course, they will be very focused. The objective should be well focused and achievable, but aim will be fairly focused, right? So when you write your aim, make sure to keep them one level upper than the objectives, right? Aim will be fairly focused, right? Now I'm going to take a small example and explain how you can derive your focus of the study, right? Now, there can be different ways to get the focus to the study, right? One might want to narrow it down to a very minor position. On the other hand, some students, they might want to keep it somewhat broad. Okay, and then I will explain the expectation from the MSc students as well. Right. So how are we going to develop the focus of our study, which will help us to develop the aim, right? Now, there are 4 studies outlined here. Okay. The first one, to investigate the impact of poorly designed buildings have on the lives of people, right? So you can see the study will investigate the impact of the poorly designed, the bad designs have on the life of the people, right? So here we are talking about the impact in general, and which could have on the lives of all the people, right? All the people. From the second study, we are investigating the impact have on the less able people, right? What's going to be the impact of poorly designed buildings have on the lives of less able people, right? Maybe the blind people, maybe the deaf people, people who are with walking difficulties, right? So from the first topic, it's about everyone, right? But from the second one, we are focusing it to the less able people. Right? Now, can you see the type of literature and the we are going to use to narrow down this research? Right? So, depending on the focus of your study, your aim will be different, right? And the literature that you are going to justify your research will also be different. Okay. Now we will move on to the third one. From the third one, we are exploring the barriers, right? Now, earlier we were talking bit broad impacts, right? But from the third research, we are talking only about the barriers that wheelchair users face in accessing poorly designed buildings, right? Earlier, the first topic about all the people. Second one, we narrow it down to less able people. From the third one, we are focusing on the wheelchair users only, right? So now, can you imagine the distantly related literature according to the funnel that I showed you earlier and the closely related literature, right? So now you all should be able to see these. And if we move to the fourth one, to investigate the barriers that the wheelchair users face in accessing public library facilities. So all these time we were talking about buildings as a whole. But from the last topic, we are talking about public library facilities, right? So you can see when it comes to a research area, there can be different stops, right? So the first student might wants to do a broader study by stopping at this point. The second one, further narrowed out. Third one, further narrowed out. And then this is a very focused minor area, right? So remember, your study also can be narrowed down based on these, and then the aim will be based on these, right? So you cannot have aim, we'll say, to investigate the impact of poorly designed buildings have on the lives of people, and do the study only about, we'll say, the wheelchair users. It will be about lives of all the people, right? And then your aim will also be changed, right? So remember, when you develop your study, where you want to get the focus, where you want to do your study, what will be your overarching aim to the study, okay? So as a caution, since we are at the master's level, right, do not narrow it down to a very focused area, right? This type of a very narrow down area will be good for a PhD or maybe a master's by research. So essentially, when you are doing your master's by taught degree, you need to ensure that you will have sufficient amount of literature to support your study, right? If you narrow it down to a very minor position, you might find it difficult to get appropriate literature, journal papers, articles, and so on, right? Therefore, stop at a middle point. Don't make it too broad as well, but narrow it down to a position where you have enough literature, where you have enough people, respondents to respond to your study, right? So remember that when you are developing your research focus and the aim of the study. Okay. Right. So aim, it is like the intention, what we are going to achieve, right? And as I mentioned to you all earlier, it will be fairly focused. It will be fairly focused, right? But when it comes to the objectives, they are the actions or the steps that you are going to reach the aim, right? And so you will have several objectives to reach this aim. And the objectives, actually, they should be focused. They should be clear, right? And when you are developing the objectives, keep this in mind. There should be a logical sequence to your objectives. you need to start from a broad objective and then closely narrow them down with a logical sequence, right? So from the initial objective, you will explore something, right? And then towards from the last objective, you are going to give some recommendations or some answers to your aim, right? So this logical approach or the logical sequence of developing the objectives is very important, right? And then the objective should be clear, unambiguous, right? They should have a very clear meaning. And also think about the ethical considerations, right? You are not going to set objectives in such a manner that it would harm any vulnerable communities, right? Or do not set out your objectives to explore some confidential information even, because it will be very difficult for you to manage at the end, right? And also remember, at the end of the day, you need to have enough resources to achieve the objectives, right? Otherwise, it will be very difficult. So basically, think about whether you have enough respondents, right? And do not select any areas of studies which is very difficult to conduct, right? Maybe a technological application that you cannot find in Sri Lanka. And how are you going to? I mean, it could be a very good research. It could be a very important study within the context of Sri Lanka. But within the given period of time, if you do not have good respondents, right? How are you going to carry out this study? So when you're formulating your objectives, think about all these, right? There should be a logical sequence. They should be clear, focused, and ethical aspects. And also, you need to have necessary resources to carry out the objectives. This is very important. Okay. Then there are some terms that we need to use and some terms that we need to avoid, right? So when you're writing the objectives, you need to have strong positive statements, or we call them as action words, right? So these action words include to determine, to identify, then to develop, right? The weak verbs include appreciate, consider, learn, to understand, right? So these are some weak verbs. Now, you all can always refer to Bloom's taxonomy of words, right? So your initial objectives can be from this part, right? And then towards the final objectives, you need to move towards this, right? You need to have very even the order of action words will depend or different based on the position of your objective. So your first objective could have a somewhat broad understanding, right? But when it comes to the latter part of your objectives, they should be somewhere from this region. Okay, so think about all these when you are developing the aim and objectives of your study. Right? Any questions regarding this part from the aim and objectives? Anyone? Right. So what I'm going to do is, we have reached the halfway point of the lecture. We will take a 5 minutes comfort break. Now the time is 7:53. Right. So we will take a small comfort break and come sharp at 8. So do not leave the meeting, but just be there. You can take a comfort break and come at 8, and we will be able to finish it thereafter. Okay. Sharp at 8. Come attend the meeting again. Okay, we will part the second part of the lecture. Right. So up to now, we identified the initial components of the synopsis, right? How we are going to write the background to the study, and then what is meant by the problem statement, and the possible ways of writing it down, and aim and the objectives, right? Also, we talked about how are we going to write the title of our study. Okay. Now, the next component of the research will be the methodology, right? Or the ways in which we are going to achieve aim and objectives, right? So research methodology is kind of a science of studying how research is done, right? Now, if you can remember from the background section, we are providing we are setting the scene to the study, right? And then when it comes to the methodology, it's basically the way of reaching our aim and objectives, right? Studying how research is done. Okay, and this will include the process that we need to follow to reach the aim and objectives in a better way, right? How we can, from the starting point to the end point. So end point will be fulfilling the aim and objectives. So how are we going to get there? Okay, what elements do I need to do to reach my final aim and objectives? That will be provided within the methodology. Okay. Right now, there will be different ways to do it, right? And most of the time, you might, some students, they come up with the answers itself, right? So, for example, rather than developing the research background, you might, now itself, you might have the answers to your research, right? So, especially, I mean, for the practicing students, that happens because you have seen the problem and you might know what needs to be done. So you might come up with the answers rather than properly developing your research problem and then carrying out in a better manner, right? However, despite knowing the answers to the research problem that you are investigating, it's important for us to correctly reach them. Okay, so at the same time, you might develop a particular research plan, a particular research methodology, but due to certain limitations, difficulties, you might not be able to achieve that plan, right? Achieve that methodology as the way you want, right? Say, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic time, we had to change many ways of doing the studies, right? And even now, you might find it difficult, even though you have well planned your research methodology, there can be certain situations where you will not be able to follow it, right? However, having said that, there may be changes to the methodology. It's very important for us to think about it, right? So when you think about the methodology in detail, you will see the alternative options, right? And you will, in a very systematic way, you will be able to identify the means and ways of achieving your objectives, right? So good research needs to be systematic, planned, organized, and with a specific goal, right? So without this one, it's going to be very difficult, right? Now, from my experience, I know how the master students, they do their research, right? So it's really good to see that you all have started it now. But I must say, unfortunately, your energy will lose. Maybe after writing the synopsis, that will be zero, right? And then what will happen is, when you know you have about, we'll say, 6 months or 3 months even, right, to complete your research, you will suddenly wake up, right, and bother everyone in the world, right, including your supervisors, right? So I have seen this throughout this MSc journey, but do not be like that. Okay, keep the energy. Now you will develop the synopsis because there's a hurdle, right? You need to pass it. But after that, don't lose that energy. Keep that. Plan it. At what times you are going to do it, and then organize yourself, and then have a very focused guideline. Otherwise, since you all are engaged with the you have other work, right? You all are working in offices, right? So with all this, you are going to forget the research, right? And the end it's a hassle. It's a hassle for the supervisor mostly, right? So do not do like that. Plan it, organize it, and then have very specific goals to reach the objectives, right? And then the methodology provides a plan or the procedure for research to reach the outcome, right? So it will help basically to fulfill your aim and objectives. And also, even though we might not be able to follow the exact research methodology we planned, at the time of planning, it will help you to make informed decisions. Now, this is very important, right? Say, for example, why am I doing interviews? Or why am I going to carry out questionnaire surveys? Or why am I going to do a case study, right? Why am I going to, whom am I going to interview, right? Are they going to be quantity surveys, engineers, skilled laborers, non-skilled laborers, right? So you are going to take informed decisions when you plan the methodology. What will be my sample size, right? And how am I going to select my sample? So methodology is very important in this regard, right? It will force you to take informed decisions, right? And then it will help you to reach the final outcome. Okay, so even if you fail or even if you cannot 100% adhere to the methodology that you planned initially, when you take informed decisions, you will think about plan B as well, right? You will think about alternative methods, right? And that will help you to do the study well, right? Maybe you have thought to do 100 questionnaire surveys, but there seems to be certain limitations of them. But at the time of planning your research, you have thought about interviews as an alternative method, right? Then you might be able to focus on that. Okay, so you can in that aspect also, research methodology will be very important. Right, so what should be there in the research methodology? Okay, now I'm not going to go into very much detail about these frameworks, right? Because we have decided that these will be too much for you all at the master's taught level. But just remember, if any of you want to get further guidance, these are the references, right? There are different frameworks that we can follow when we do our research, right? Now, this is one of them, which talks about philosophy, approach, techniques, right? And then this is the so-called research onion. Here also you can see there are different layers, right? So it's like layers in onion. Philosophy, then we have something called approach, research choices, strategies, the time horizon, and the data collection techniques. Okay, so different layers, but most of the time the research students, the master students, the taught master students will not focus on the philosophy. But there isn't any barrier for you all to discuss this one. But generally what we have seen is you will straight away jump onto the data collection and analysis technique, right? But it's really good if you can start somewhere here, at least from the research choices, right? Research choices, whether which research choice would better suit you, right? So with that understanding, I'm not going to much detail with regard to these two layers, the first two layers, philosophy and the approach, but I will focus mainly on the research choice because this is what will be important to you all. Okay. So when it comes to the research choice, there are qualitative research choices and quantitative research choices. Okay. And also, I want to highlight another aspect. There are different terms that's been used, right? Say, for example, a particular author might identify these qualitative, quantitative aspects as research choices. Another author might identify them as research approaches, right? So these terms are used in a very mixed manner. Okay, but what matters to you is you need to think about a particular set of terms and then follow them. Say, for example, here I am using the term research choice, and then I'm using them throughout my study. I'm not going to combine with them any other terms that's been used elsewhere, right? Okay, so if I quickly explain about research choices, research choice refers to the qualitative, quantitative, or the mixed research choice way. Okay, so when it comes to the qualitative studies, now some of your studies could fall within the qualitative research choice, right? So if it is qualitative, you are going to use words, right? Respondents in interpretation. Say, for example, interview is one of the very good ways of carrying out a qualitative research, right? So it can be unstructured or semi-structured, right? And then you're going to deal with deep, soft data, right? As opposed to in a quantitative study, you're going to deal with numbers, hard data, right? So in a qualitative study, the outcome will be subjective because it's going to be based on the opinions of other people, for example, right? But in a quantitative study, it's going to be objective, right? So likewise, depending on the research choice, depending on your research area, the focus of the research, you need to select the appropriate research choice to your study, right? If you want to explore something in deep and something that hasn't been carried out earlier up to some extent, then a qualitative research choice will be better suited, right? If your study is about something that can be explored objectively, then quantitative research choice would better suit you. Okay. Now, there are strengths and weaknesses of both these research choices, right? Therefore, most of the time, students tend to go for mixed method as well. Mixed method means we are using a combination of qualitative and quantitative research choices, right? Say, for example, your study could involve carrying out some interviews and also some questionnaire surveys, right? So carefully think which research choice better suits you to address your research focus to fulfill the aim and objectives of your study. Okay. And then moving on to the next layer, right? So I skipped research philosophy and approach because it's not that much relevant to you all. We talked about the research choice, and the next layer is the research strategy. And there are different research strategies, right? Case studies, surveys, experiments, ethnographical study, and action research, right? And there are many other research strategies as well. So I think case studies, you all must be familiar with that. So you are going to select a particular case and do an in-depth study based on that. I think Dr. Sachi has done a session yesterday for case studies, right? Another research strategy could be carrying out surveys, right? Now, surveys can be quantitative as well as qualitative. There can be qualitative surveys as well, right? So think about the strategy you are going to use. Then action research means as part of your study, there will be an action component that you would want to implement, right? Say, for example, you might develop a a waste management strategy, and then you are going to apply it to a particular organization and then observe the changes it could make, right? So there will be an action component in your study. Then ethnographical studies, which will take a lot of time, where you are going to be a part of the research environment and do the study, right? So action research, ethnographical studies will take additional time and it will be a bit difficult at this point. But of course, case studies, survey strategies, right? Even experiments, right? So now there is, especially if you are coming from engineering background, you might think about this particular research strategy as well, experiments. Okay. So think about a suitable research strategy for your work. That is also very important. And then the next layer is the time horizon, right? The time horizon, which you can think of. When it comes to time horizon, there are two time horizons. The first one is it can be a cross-sectional analysis. That means you are doing your study at a particular time. And most of our studies will be cross-sectional. As opposed to that, we have the longitudinal studies. Longitudinal studies means we are going to investigate a particular phenomenon over a given period of time. Right? Say, for example, my eating habits. Right? So what did I eat when I was a little kid, maybe a teenager, when I was 30, when I was 40, 50, 60, and when I'm going to be very old, right? So the eating habits will change over the period of time, and the study will be a longitudinal study, right? In a practical sense, one of the studies that we have carried out, how the disaster management strategies have been evolved over the past years, right? So in 2004, when tsunami hit Sri Lanka, we did not have many disaster risk reduction strategies in place, right? But if we compare the strategies that we have at the moment, they are well developed. Even the disaster victims' perspectives are now considered, right? So we did a study about how the disaster management strategies have been evolved over a period of time, over the 2 decades, something like that, right? So that will be considered as a longitudinal studies, right? But mostly, your studies will fall within the cross-sectional time horizon. Okay. Then moving on to the research methods, right? I think this is the part that most of you think of. Okay. The final outcome or the final way of carrying out the study. It can be interviews, and interviews can be semi-structured, structured, right? There can be surveys, questionnaire surveys, right? And then desk studies, right? Observations. So there will be, and focus group, right? There will be so many research methods, but it's important for you all to select the appropriate data collection method, right? And then based on the data collection method, right? The data collection technique, the analyzing technique you are going to use will also vary, right? If we use interviews, you will go for content analysis, cognitive maps, right? If we use a close-ended questionnaire, it will be a statistical analysis. You will think about analyzing by using the means, standard deviations, right? IRR, there will be so many methods for you to analyze the data, right? So think about the data collection methods as well as the analyzing methods, right? So in a nutshell, think about the methodology you are going to use, right? And you can briefly mention this in the synopsis, but do not go into much detail because in the thesis, there will be a separate chapter for your research methodology where you can start from, it's good to start from at least research choice and then do it, right? Good to start from research choice, provide justifications for using whether it is qualitative, quantitative. Always think about the why component. Why the qualitative research choice? Why the quantitative research choice? Or if your research strategy is case study, why? If the time horizon is longitudinal, why? Right? And if you are selecting interviews, why you are selecting interviews? All these should be justified in a very detailed manner when it comes to your final thesis. Okay? Right. So, in conclusion, right, from today's lecture, we talked about the synopsis development, right? And we discussed about the components we need to think about, right? The title, introduction, backgrounds area, then the problem statement, right? Hope you all can remember the different ways of structuring the problem statement. Justification, of course, it can be within the problem statement, but make sure that your research, the chosen research area is well justified. Okay. And then aim and objectives of the study. Think about the terminology you need to use, the logical sequence of the aim and objectives, right? And finally, there should be a brief methodology, right? Not in a very detailed manner, but briefly you need to outline the methodology, scope and limitations. Of course, you can provide the chapter breakdown and the references, right? So as I mentioned to you all at the very beginning, refer to the dissertation handbook for the word limits, then the submission deadlines, and so on. Okay. And most of the time, right, so you all can read this. Most of the time, what happens is you would come up with the solution, right? And I know this is pretty much applicable to MSc taught students since you are coming from a practical background. So you will come up with the answer, you will come up with the solution, right? But what is missing is the problem to go with that. Okay, so if you have identified the solutions now, right? We all are like that. Okay, we tend to think about the final point of our dissertation, right? Then at least you need to provide a very good theoretical background to reach these solutions and the problems. Okay, so make sure, even if it is a practice-based problem, to provide a good justification, a good theoretical background, go through the literature sources and justify your arguments and develop the research problem and develop the synopsis. Okay, so that's the end. If you want to ask anything with regard to the synopsis, or if you want to discuss anything about your research areas or maybe how to narrow them down, I'm more than happy to do that. Anything you want to ask? Okay, so if not, we will conclude the lecture for today. Thank you very much for joining early morning, and I hope you all have got some other lectures today as well. Okay, then I will conclude. Thank you.